Hey, everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And yesterday we were talking about that show I saw last week, The Green Knight. And by the way, quick aside, hey, go movies. I've seen like 4 movies in the last 4 or 5 weeks that have been good and like how movies used to be when they made a point and they followed the journey of a hero who needed to figure some things out, and the hero has their own problems that they need to work through, and it's not a 2-hour lecture about how people want things to be. And don't hear that the wrong way. I'm not Mr. I don't like lectures from people who disagree with me, but I do like movies that are lectures from people who theoretically do agree with me. If you like lectures in your movies, we don't agree. I am not there for a sermon. I'm there for art. I'm there for stories that with a deft touch deal with morality and bigger human ideas. It's refreshing. I've really appreciated that of late. But in this Green Knight thing, we talked yesterday about how there are 2 levels of interpretation. One is through the lenses of the ordeal that the Green Knight himself is going through. And then there's the larger meta-level interpretation of what it all means and what green symbolizes and what's the big overarching story that we can point to here. And yesterday, we looked at this passage we've been working on in Matthew chapter 20 that centers around this parable about how the kingdom is and workers who the master of the vineyard goes and hires at different points in the day, and then he pays them all the same amount, and it's confusing for some people and a blessing to other people. And in the end, the master is like, hey, it's my money. If I want to be gracious to people who got here late in the day, cool. If I want to pay you what we agreed upon, cool. And the point first and foremost is look at the character of the master here, the God character in the story. He's benevolent and good and gracious, and he keeps his promises and follows through on what he says he's going to do and even goes above and beyond. But then on the secondary level, there's the singular overt point that bookends this parable, and that being that many who are first will be last and many who are last will be first. So yesterday we looked at the overt interpretation through the narrative point of view character lenses of Sir Peter, who is going through this ordeal, and this is one of the great tests or stages in his ordeal. And today I want to look at some of the ideas that good, smart people have thrown out over the centuries of what the meta-interpretive point of this parable might be. Some of the big picture interpretations I've heard over the years are, one, that just in general, justice means reversal. That if people have stuff, they shouldn't have stuff anymore. And in the kingdom, that stripping of stuff is part of the larger flow of God's justice, and those who are deprived will have wealth, and those who have wealth are deprived. This interpretation has been tweaked ever so slightly since the thoughts and writings of Karl Marx were introduced to mainstream thought in the late 19th century. I know his name is a trigger for a whole lot of people who are going to listen to this and be like, yeah, that guy's awesome. And other people are like, that guy's the worst and he's ruining everything. I'm really not trying to make a statement on that one way or the other than to say that with the advent of Marxist thought came the advent of a whole new morality and a whole new interpretive set of lenses for evaluating culture and history. The new morality is that everything can be best explained in an oppressor-oppressed relationship. Now, I think this has its limits. Certainly, oppressing and being oppressed are a reality. They're a reality that the Bible speaks to. But not all human relationships can be explained this way, and surely the relationship between the individual or the kingdom citizens and the king himself in the Bible cannot be explained this way. This isn't an oppressor-oppression narrative. This notion that oppressor and oppressed is the cipher for every relationship and everything that's going on, this is an incomplete look at how life works. But it is a very politically expedient way to interpret the world. And so, depending on people's political proclivities one way or another, they might really latch on to that. They might really not latch on to that. But we have to admit that in the first 1900-ish years of Christianity, this idea of an issue of oppressor and oppressed, it really wasn't the primary way this kind of stuff was interpreted. It was more that life and the physical world is something that is working against us. Sin is the oppressor. The enemy is the oppressor. And our own shortcomings, we are our own oppressors. And the liberator, the one who gives life and gives it abundantly, is Christ. And this happens through his work and his kingdom. It's only much more recently that passages like this have been slightly reimagined in light of more of a social gospel, and a social gospel through the lenses of a Marxist view of society and history. Another very popular read on this passage is the idea that each of us need to not think of ourselves so highly, to submit to other people and submit deeply to the King and understand the reality of our position and be truly humble, if that's even something that you can achieve. To me, that really resonates with what I'm hearing throughout the book of Matthew. But as is often the case, we go looking through the Bible, or we go trying to interpret a passage, and we're like, what is the interpretation? What is the thing that it means? And it's possible that some of these passages have multiple layers of meaning, in the same way that a good story, a good movie, a good book have multiple layers of meaning, and those themes get teased out in different ways and strike chords or rhyme with different parts of the rest of the book. Another one that, again, has become more prominent in recent years is one that is born out of a need to use this passage to fit with larger theological assumptions about the relationship between Israel and not Israel. I do think it's reasonable to imagine that, at least to some degree, that is in view here. You've got a situation where God picked a people out of the clear blue sky all the way back at the beginning of Genesis with Abram, who became Abraham. And God makes a deal with Abraham and is like, I'm going to make you into a great nation. You're going to have all these kids. It's going to be huge. It's going to be amazing. And I'm going to bless you, and you're going to be a blessing to all of the nations, or all of the nations will be blessed through you. And it kind of sets the whole trajectory for how the Old Testament works out. And it looks like God is going to do something very uniquely redemptive through this chosen people group. And as you get to the New Testament, Jesus is saying that he is the fulfillment of all of that stuff. He's the completion of it. Well, then that leaves us with a question, and that is, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that when you flip from the Old Testament system to the death and resurrection of Jesus, that there's some kind of pivot that happens there in terms of God's grand plan for everything, where in the past, God's deals were all with Israel, but now somehow the church replaces Israel. And so some people would say, well, now all of the promises of the Old Testament, all the covenants, everything, they're all fulfilled in Jesus, and now they're all given to the church, this new family of faith. Other people look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they're like, nah, it looks like all of those promises to Israel are still there. How exactly do those get fulfilled and work out? I don't know. And so in the very simplest of terms, you've got two general camps. One camp saying, nope, after the cross and resurrection, everything is lumped into this new family of faith, this new deal. And some of God's chosen people, the Jews, are going to jump in with this new family of faith, and others are not. This other camp would include a whole bunch of different people who in different ways would say, no, it looks like maybe this is still the deal for Israel. And yeah, you got the church too. Whichever of those two camps a theologian is coming from, this passage becomes pretty important, because it could be interpreted as saying that the initial workers were the people of Israel, and then the later workers are not God's chosen people. They're the Gentiles, the outsiders who've been invited into this new family of faith, and maybe the grumblers are the Jewish people, and maybe the master is saying to them, like, hey, I'm going to extend my grace to whomever I want. You're with me from the early days, and that's awesome, and now these people are here, and everybody receives my blessing equally. If you're from the other camp, maybe you look at this parable and you see two distinctive groups here. It saddens me that this is a point of oddly intense controversy right now amongst Christians. It is entirely reasonable for somebody to read the book of Matthew and say, this is clearly happening against the backdrop of Judaism and the promises that were made to the Jews and the historical expectations, the prophetic expectations. But it's also entirely reasonable for somebody to look at that and say, yes, and while it is exploring those tensions, it is also pointing to how Christ is completing that part of the narrative. And there's something much bigger going on here, and there really is a shift. Ultimately, that'll be something that we'll probably have more opportunities to poke at down the road. But for our purposes today, let me get to a couple of the other historically popular meta-narrative interpretations of this passage. So another read on this passage is flowing out of the early material from Matthew, where you had the people who should have had their eyes opened not be able to see anything, and the physically blind people be able to see things, not with their eyes, but with their hearts. Their eyes were opened, their ears were opened, and Jesus attributes this to God. God did the opening up. God is the one who made them aware. I mean, this harkens back to Peter in Matthew 16 and him being like, I think you're the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus is like, yep, and you did not figure that out. That was from God. The people who theoretically should be getting it and are proud and are impressive, they actually don't get it and they are brought low. And the people who theoretically don't get it and can't get it and could never figure it out, they actually are going to have their eyes and ears opened by God, and they will be brought high, not by their own merit, but by the grace of God. It's interesting when a parable like this doesn't get an in-text interpretation of Jesus, because it does leave it open for people to take this parable and try to make it fit with their larger systems of theological thought that they're crafting as they work their way through the Bible. That's a perfectly understandable exercise. For me, I go back to what we talked about yesterday. I think first and foremost, the reason this passage is in the text is because it's prompted by Peter's question, and Peter is on an ordeal quest. He's figuring out who he is and who Jesus is and what it looks like for him to be in the kingdom and what the kingdom means. And while I suppose there are elements of all of those possible meta interpretations that we talked about today, I still believe that at the most basic, fundamental level, this is Jesus looking right back at Peter and anyone who would follow in the footsteps of Peter and being like, hey, stay humble. This whole thing is about God. You should not presume on God that you're going to get a gigantic pat on the back for every single thing ever. And additionally, the context and the flow of the whole thing says to me that whole warning about the people who grumble at the end, they're clearly the ones who are getting it wrong. I think that warning is for Peter and anyone who would follow in his footsteps, imagining that somehow because Peter or we did some really nice stuff and have a very fancy religious resume, that somehow now all of a sudden we are owed something and the people who come along after are owed less. The admonition is then that God is gracious and he is good and he is generous. And regardless of where somebody comes into the game, the thing to do with the grace of God is not to pat yourself on the back for how much more you deserve it than other people, but to receive that whole thing humbly and to celebrate that other people receive those gifts. More Matthew 20 mañana. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.